Okay, so we're going to discuss today probably a couple of topics that maybe are slightly under the radar when it comes to sustainability compared to the ones that often are in the news. And the first one I think is around water usage. Now, The World and His Wife, and I think everyone saw the Panorama program the other week. The amount of power that data centers consumed, everyone is fully aware of that. But water usage is perhaps not so well understood in terms of how much. But is that externally only, or do data center users, operators themselves perhaps not have a complete handle on how much water they do need and how much they use?
I think from a data center operator point of view, we're acutely aware of how much water is being consumed in the buildings. There's a lot of metering that goes on to make sure that it's being used as effectively as possible. I think what's worth just casting our minds back a little bit as to why we used water or chose to start using water in the first place. So we're looking at decisions that were made 10 to 15 years ago when we were trying to improve the energy efficiency of data centers, and discovered that, well, not discovered, it's an ancient technology, but realized there was an application in data centers to use water, evaporate it, and therefore cool the air down. And that was seen as being much more energy efficient or energy responsible than using electricity to power a chiller or other sort of energy hungry ways of cooling the facility. Now, as data centers have got a lot bigger over that time frame, and the demands of them have increased enormously, the volume of water associated with it has grown dramatically. So where we were making decisions for absolutely the right reasons to reduce the energy footprint of a data center by using water, the design circumstances have changed, the usage of these facilities has changed, and therefore water is probably not the most appropriate way of cooling the facilities anymore. But of course, when you build something for a 20-year lifespan or longer, we're rather left with this legacy of decisions that were made for absolutely the right reasons at a previous time. So the thing the challenge we're met with now is, how do we try to reverse some of that water decision? Like how do we try to use less of it, even though we've kind of committed to this technology because it was a decision made for all the right reasons 10 or so years ago.
Yeah, and in terms of the importance of sort of measuring that consumption, I mean, the industry, PUE, again, everyone understands, I think, pretty well. And there are fans of it and people who think it's open to a certain amount of abuse, shall we say. But there is also obviously the water usage effectiveness, comparable metric. But again, is that similarly sort of, you can be a fan of it, or you can hide behind, in a certain way, hide, a lot of water usage, but sort of pretend that you're doing it effectively, just how you interpret that metric, what's going on with it?
Yeah, so with water usage effectiveness, you're really, the reference on the effectiveness side of things is how much water are you evaporating. So how much are you taking out of the water distribution system and evaporating up into the atmosphere and waiting for the water cycle to bring it back down to earth again and go back into the system. The way the element of perhaps skewed reporting on this is, it doesn't consider how much water on a gross basis comes through the facility. So how much water is evaporated, but also how much water is sent straight back into the sewers that hasn't really performed any function other than to make sure that systems have been cleaned out, there aren't any bacterial growth or anything like that in the water systems held on site. Now, the amount of water on a gross basis is very, very significant. But the WUE figures can be made to look pretty good, because if you only consider how much water you've evaporated, you've sort of missed the point. Now, it is quite a contentious issue amongst the industry as to what is the right thing to do. And I think there are several in the camp of thinking, well, actually, just because you've taken that water off the grid water supply system, just measuring how much you've evaporated doesn't seem to be particularly responsible, because you've thrown all of this other water back into the system for it to be reprocessed before it can be provided back to other consumers. So we should probably be looking at that rather than just worrying about what is being evaporated. And then, of course, you get people that are staunchly in the other camp as well. So it's there's a bit of infighting as to what the most appropriate measurement criteria is, but fundamentally we should be looking at things on the how much of a precious resource are we using in the whole, not just from our process cooling point of view.
Okay, so data centers need to measure or understand how much water, as you say, they're bringing into the. I mean, I'm slightly intrigued because I presume they're all, you know, on a meter. They're paying for the amount of water that is supplied to them, but is the cost of that so insignificant compared to, say, their power bill, that if they're wasting a load of water, it really doesn't register in their sort of, you know, accounts, or is that an area of negligence that they need to look at anyway? But let's say back to the, I guess, the main point, they need to understand how much water is, you know, arriving at the facility, as well as how much is leaving it, whether it's going, as you say, in the sewer or, you know, into the air.
Yeah, so everyone will know how much water is arriving at the facility, because we get the bills to tell us how much money we owe to the water companies, and this isn't particularly an element of cost and being negligent. It's the point is that we're not in full agreement on the metrics by which we get measured on the WUE. So if you put a meter on your water supply coming in and a meter on your water supply going out, the difference is what you're using for your WUE, i.e. how much water has been evaporated from that facility. Whereas arguably you should be considering how much total water is coming into the facility. The issue is not around whether people are being responsible on the cost side of things. It's around just how much water you're using, and the driver for sending away or discharging more of that water is in order to make sure that bacterial levels within the water held on site don't get to a dangerous level and cause things like Legionnaire's disease or other airborne, droplet-borne bacterial infections like that. So it's very important to look after the water and discharge it when you meet any of those kind of criteria. But as I say, this isn't necessarily a cost thing; it's a safety thing.
So I guess the issue is that people are sort of getting a load of water delivered to the site and not being very responsible with how they use it. And as you say, then they might have to get rid of it before they've used it for safety reasons. So the WUE sort of metric is not particularly fit for purpose, as you say, because it's only measuring the water that actually used, if you like. And so they might have a load that just ends up back in the drains. And I mean, that's cost the water company to treat it, deliver it to site. Okay, it's been paid for, but from a sustainability angle, that's a fairly wasteful way to get loads of water delivered and use a sort of random amount before getting rid of it.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. But you know, rather than feeling like the industry is being painted in a bad way because of that, it's really important that we remember why these design decisions were made, and it was for absolutely the right reason at that time, because data centers were far smaller. The volume of water was far less than it is now, and the issue is that, you know, we're cast back 15 years or so, and iPhones were very new to us all back then, and look how much has changed in that time. Our need for data has grown unbelievably in that time, and so has the magnitude of some of those design decisions that were made back in those days. where we thought we were doing things for absolutely the right reason, the impact of those decisions has become quite significant. You know, the knock-on effect of those decisions is huge. So I don't think it's necessarily something that the industry has intentionally tried to mislead people, not at all. But it is a legacy of decisions that were made quite a long time ago. And I'd say when you're looking at a lot of the design decisions now, the focus is moved back to using grid electricity, which has caused its own problems on utility expansion, capacity within the grid to be able to support it. So yeah, as data centers are using a lot more energy or a lot more resources, we're starting to see how materially impactful data centers can be on those resources, and how do we make sure that we're not going to find a similar sort of water problem in 10 or 15 years time.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, the power thing's well understood, and the war in Ukraine, I guess, has exaggerated that, and so everyone's fully aware. Water's, yeah, I mean, I do actually do some work in the water industry, and as I say, I mean, there've been droughts and stuff, but I guess in the UK at least, we kid ourselves that because it rains half the time, there's plenty of water to go around, when actually that's not the case. But for data centers, though, there are ways they can improve their water efficiency, and I'm guessing that good old technology, AI and stuff, is one way that they can have better control. Is that right?
Yeah, so there are ways to limit how much water is being discharged before it's done a useful task. Additional sensors and water treatment plants and so on within the facilities to make sure that you're only getting rid of it when you absolutely have to. But it's a fine balance between the risks that are posed by holding on to water and warming it up more than you really want to for bacterial growth reasons, versus being responsible with that water in the first place. I mean, you could try to hold on to all of it until you've evaporated it, but then you may well be being irresponsible in nasty contaminant growth or concentrations within that water.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that, I mean, the industry is fully aware, as I say, of the energy. I mean, renewable energy, and there's vast amounts of work being done on that. At this moment in time, would you say that water is sort of the poor cousin, in the sense that not the I mean, I guess you can't get renewable water if you like, but in terms of better stewardship when it comes to water resources, the industry is, as you say, for understandable reasons, it is where it is, but it does need to sort of do a similar thing with water as that is already doing with power. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think that's already happened over the last few years. A lot of the design decisions have moved away from using water and more to using more efficient cooling systems relying on power, so that a number of data center operators have declared that they will be water zero or net zero on water, or even on positive on water. Quite how that works, I'm not entirely sure, but there is definitely a shift back towards using grid power, but only through using efficient design, so that we're not going to end up using significantly more energy, because that would be irresponsible as well.
And the second sort of topic, we can't avoid power, because that's clearly a significant issue for data centers. And I think you're suggesting that fusion power has a role to play. And for myself and potentially others, fusion power, I think nuclear fission is the way of doing it now. So can you just clarify, because a minute anyone mentions nuclear power and data centers, I guess everyone gets a bit nervous, but can you sort of explain what fusion power is to start with?
So fusion power is essentially the opposite of fission, and as you say, fission is what we're used to at the moment, and that fusion has been one of these challenges for many, many, many years, and always been 10 or so years away from being reality, and does unlock this potential to be near on limitless, very efficient source of energy. Now that energy could be, the energy is really created as heat. Now that heat can be used to create electricity, or it can be used to go into industrial processes where lots of heat is required. And the interesting thing about it is there are now a number of private organizations who are making significant steps forward in development of this technology that we haven't seen for a long time, as they've been predominantly public funded exercises. So it does feel like we're getting to something that could well be seen within lifetimes of us. That, you know, maybe 10 to 15 years, we've got something that can deliver us reliable, stable, essentially renewable power, or carbon-free power. So the challenge we have as a data center industry is we need to have consistent base load generation to be able to support how data centers operate. You know, they operate with pretty much the same load 24/7, 365 days of the year. So something like a wind farm and a solar farm, they don't really meet the profile of that. So in order for those to be relevant on the grid, we need to have gas generation schemes that can be turned up and down as and when the wind does or does not blow. Whereas with fusion, we get this stable generation, which is very exciting from a data center point of view, because that marries very nicely with the load profile. Plus, it can be of mutual benefit to local district heating systems and so on. As a data center industry at the moment, we're looking at how do we practically export the heat that is being generated within the data centers to be of benefit to residential developments or commercial or industrial developments, even greenhouses to help people's tomatoes grow a little bit faster. There is a lot more of a view on how does the data center become part of the ecosystem, rather than it sort of sitting nondescript out in the middle of nowhere, whirring away, consuming everyone's power and water.
And in terms of the practicalities of fusion power, I mean, are we talking sort of huge, great power stations, or are we talking on-site, you know, sort of micro or mini sort of power stations that so data centers would have the potential to, you know, have their own fusion plant, if you like, on the data center site and be self-sufficient? What does that sort of landscape look like?
Well, I quite like the idea of the smaller scale, that we're talking a couple of 100 megawatts, where we can put those on data center campuses and they can be relatively self-sufficient, and on that basis not consuming the resources that are in such high demand for housing developments and other applications. So yeah, I think we're already seeing some interest in the small modular reactors from the likes of Rolls-Royce. Those are fission reactors, but the same sort of concept, that can we build those more locally to where the demand is, rather than relying on the national infrastructure, like the national grid, to deliver the power to where it's needed. Why don't we try to solve that problem locally, so that the enormous infrastructure investment is not required by data centers? We sort of take ourselves away from that problem.
And in terms, I mean, it's a confusing landscape when it comes to energy, and I wouldn't necessarily have a pop at the government, because there's all manner of lobbying groups and technologies with their champions and opponents. But do you think fusion, from where you're sat, fusion looks like it's a very significant opportunity as you know, for the reasons you've outlined, compared to some of the, I mean, obviously wind and solar works for the national grid to a certain extent, and energy storage no doubt will, you know, improve the way those can be used. But do you think fusion is one of those that may well come up sort of top of the pile as and when, you know, the overall strategy is decided upon or you know, developed in the coming years?
I think it represents the most significant opportunity to generate near limitless amounts of power without carbon impact. So absolutely, but our challenge at the moment is if we believe that this technology is coming, well, we can't sit around and wait for it. We need to work out what we do in the meantime without causing our planet so much damage that it's going to become irreversible. So the solar farms and the wind farms have a very significant part to play in the next 10 years or so, however long the fusion technology will take to come to fruition. Now, because those are they're not consistent generators, we need to back it up with the gas generation schemes, which feels you know, it feels like that's not an enormously responsible thing to do, because burning gas is obviously not great from an environmental point of view. But what it does do is allow us to look at things like hydrogen. Can we create green hydrogen from the surplus energy that some of these wind farms create? Can we use that extra energy to run an electrolysis plant and form hydrogen out of it, and then stick that into the national grid for gas, and then use that in our gas turbines or gas generation schemes? How do we green that natural gas to a point where we absolutely understand that this is not what we would really like to be doing forever, but we do have to have a transition period where we go from our traditional hydrocarbon based energy schemes to a carbon-free energy generation scheme. The big challenge from a data center point of view is, as I say, these require very steady power supplies to the site. So if we can't match that with a steady generation scheme like fusion, then we need to have a hybrid between wind, solar, hydroelectric in certain parts of the world, and gas generation to back it up when there isn't the sun shining or the wind blowing.
And yeah, and as you say, in the wait for fusion, you mentioned hydrogen. I mean, I've read a little bit about, I think, saltwater batteries people are talking about. Again, with my water industry hat on, I think there's some suggestion that even ammonia can be, well, I guess the waste product from ammonia can be used, you know, repurposed for energy generation. So do you think there's a range of things, but that potentially, as you say, in the short term for, and data centers in particular, and again, is some of that on-site generation as opposed to just getting, you know, the national grid to pump in? Are there some opportunities for data centers to do that as well?
I think it's the exciting thing about the data center industry is we have the opportunities to drive some of this innovation, because the need for our facilities is so significant that we have to be creative. You know, the necessity being mother of all invention. we must work out how to solve our problems, because it's not going to come from national infrastructure, or it might do, but it will take too long. And we're looking at main utility substation upgrades taking 10 to 15 years. Well, I'm sure people will be terribly upset in that 10 to 15 year period if they can't, you know, look at their family photos from 15 years ago on Facebook. You know, this is the nature of the problem that we have. The demand is insatiable. So as an industry, we must be pushing forward to find alternative means to support the growth without it impacting on us as consumers. So I don't want to have rolling blackouts in my house simply so that I can watch the TV online. That doesn't seem sensible. So we do take it extremely seriously to drive some of this development. And no, at the moment, no idea is a bad idea. So we're looking at things like, can we put hydrogen into a natural gas mix and green the gas a little bit? Can we even get enough hydrogen to be able to just use that solely? At the moment, no, but maybe we can in the future. Yeah, there are several of these ideas that are not off the table yet.
And do you think the industry, I mean, clearly for its own sort of, I would say self-preservation sounds a bit dramatic, but for its own security, it has a vested interest there. But do you think it has a sort of wider responsibility, bearing in mind, as I say, it is a significant consumer of power, and as you say, we don't all want to have the lights go out once a week just because the data centers need to be kept going. So do you think there is a wider responsibility to society? But also, I suppose there's a PR sort of opportunity that the industry can, say, yeah, okay, you want to try and hammer us for all the power we consume, but hey, we're actually working at the front, sort of cutting edge, developing or helping to develop some of these new fuel sources. So, give us a bit of slack. Well, how do you see the sort of data center, sat in that sort of debate?
I think it's quite important for us to get away from this notion that it's PR. Because I look at this as a consumer of significant digital services myself. I have online banking. My doctor's appointments are booked through a website. The way that I rely on access to data is it's significant. I can't necessarily imagine not having access to it. So it's more that this is. It is of critical importance that we work out how to be able to satisfy the growth of this resource, I suppose, so that we don't end up in situations where we might have enforced limits on how much data we can consume as individuals, or limitations on medical research that are conducted on supercomputers. That it doesn't feel like just a PR exercise is going to solve the problem here. This is a broad-ranging problem that sits within the industry, and we have the ability to make some material steps forward to solving it, because we cannot simply wait for the likes of the national grids of the world to work out how to get more power to the data centers. We've got to do some of it on our own.
And just in terms of the different types of data centers, does what we've discussed, does it make any difference? Because I mean, legacy data centers are potentially not able to, shall we say, be re-engineered completely to a sustainable, whereas obviously if you start with a green field, you've got every opportunity to incorporate the very latest. Do you worry slightly that there is such a large legacy data center, which for reasons we've discussed, you can't just switch them off tomorrow because they are doing a very useful role, but longer term they will have to be replaced rather than upgraded, or do you think legacy data centers do have a long-term role?
It depends, and I know that's the most unhelpful answer, but so if we look at legacy data centers, we've got those that sprung up through the early days of telecommunications, where they were the hubs for all interconnectivity. Now, generally speaking, those are quite small facilities in today's metrics, so that the magnitude of the problem around them isn't that significant, but they play an incredibly important part in how the internet works, how we communicate with each other. So I don't think those types of facilities should ever really be in the spotlight. They are essentially parts of critical national infrastructure that allow the internet to work. They don't consume a huge amount of energy, so in comparison to where we are now, so those are probably not the bad guys. Where we're looking at facilities that were built for pre-cloud, so the enterprise customers like the banks, insurance companies, where they used to have their own facilities, those are probably the contenders that we really need to be dealing with as an industry to improve the efficiency of those, because as those businesses move to cloud, and these data centers are sort of sat waiting for their next opportunity, their new lease of life, whether it be to now have a cloud data center in there or other. It's those sorts of facilities that need the most attention, and it may be deemed that they're simply not big enough to satisfy the requirements of the industry now, that they will be repurposed back into what they were before, which is usually a logistics center or something similar. They tend to sit on industrial parks around the country.
And just quickly, because you give me a lot of time, in terms of the size of data centers, I mean, there's been clearly a lot of talk about the edge and rolling that out, and I don't think two people agree what it looks like and where it's going to end up. But fundamentally, you're talking about more and smaller, more local facilities. Do you think, to the point of our conversation about sustainability, there'll still be some need for huge, great centralized data centers, but the trend might be for more of this. Like for example, I think I saw a release the other week that a data center is now the waste heat is being used to heat a swimming pool somewhere in. So do you think there'll be more and more of those almost like community data centers when they're building a new whatever it is, we'll bung a data center almost in the middle, and that'll be the hub because that will generate all the the heat required? How do you if it's possible to sort of predict, how do you see that sort of landscape? Will we still have huge data centers being built in London, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, or will it be much more very local, each sort of county town or whatever you want to say, will have a data center which will supply a lot of the the heat resources for people? Just any thoughts on
that? So the big data centers are very much here to stay, because from an efficiency and an economy of scale, they are far more effective than having multiple small facilities. And I think from a planning point of view, it does make sense to try and keep the data centers together, because it suits the network requirements of those facilities, but it also suits from a city planning point of view, that if you keep those sorts of industries together, you can make sure that the power is directed in that sort of area, and you can look at how to export heat, for example, in a mutually beneficial way to the surrounding areas. The notion of having a sort of town or village community data center, I think, is probably not so necessary, given particularly in the UK, where we have the rollout of gigabit fiber to homes. You probably don't need to be terribly close to your data center if that sort of infrastructure upgrade is happening. The idea of heating your local swimming pool from a data center is brilliant, but I think what's been proved in some examples is you only need to have the equipment that would have been at that leisure center anyway to run the access control systems and the back office functions and so on, to be able to generate a reasonable amount of heat to start supporting the swimming pool. But the fact that up until now you've had a leisure center with a room with an air conditioning unit in it to keep all of those IT systems cold, and then a huge, great big gas supply coming in to heat the water up for the swimming pool. It's more about working out where do these mutually beneficial situations exist, and how can we sensibly extract the heat from IT and use it where we would otherwise be using gas or electricity to provide heating. And some material things can be done with that. a lot of that stuff that sits in the IT room at the leisure centre can't go to cloud. It needs to be local. So how do we deal with those things in a more efficient manner?
Okay, so if it's possible to summarize, I mean, when it comes to how this is going to develop, it sounds as if a lot of it is down to sort of education and people understanding of, you know, what is and isn't practical, and then what makes, you know, commercial sense. And there's maybe, I say, a lot of organizations, particularly if they're not IT specialists, that don't necessarily understand it. Are you sort of optimistic that the sort of conversation and the actions that follow will get us, you know, whether it's 2030, which I know a lot of data centers sort of created to sort of get to net zero, and 2050 is the big sort of global sort of, you know, target to aim for. Are you optimistic that the industry's sort of on the right path, or would you be slightly worried that too many people are sort of reticent or holding on to some of their sort of older practices? And you know, maybe for understandable reasons, because a lot of what we talked about is maybe not so proven, and you know, back to data centers, you don't want to risk the whole thing coming down just because you're doing something a bit novel with your power supply. So if you can summarize, if you like, yeah, where the data center industry is at, and if you're optimistic it's going to get where it needs to be.
I'm really optimistic that the attitudes amongst the data center community have changed a lot, in the sense that this isn't now a PR or a greenwashing type exercise. It is a general feeling that we have a responsibility to be better custodians of the land that we're using, of the energy that we're consuming, and the water that we're using. And if we can try to be better community citizens, as it were, so exporting things that are waste to us, like heat, which in turn will reduce the energy consumed by the facility in cooling those servers down. I think we're at a really exciting point in the industry where actually everyone seems to now be pushing together in the right direction. You're not seeing people saying, I don't want my sustainability agenda to cost me huge amounts of money, because it's not about that anymore. It's about making sure that we're building the digital infrastructure for everyone that isn't going to cause a great deal of damage. We want to make sure that we're building a sustainable growth plan for digital infrastructure.
I mean, we covered a lot of ground and you give me a lot of time. So Tom, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
No, not at all.